Welcome. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this beautiful Wednesday morning. As we start, I'd like to recognise that we're all joining from different places across the country and potentially from around the world. So I would like to start with an invitation for everyone to pay their respects to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that you're joining from today, and doing so in a way that feels right to you. I'm joining from the lands of the Behaviours people here in Sydney. And a little bit of background about this place that I'm joining from. The Behaviours people right here on this land were the very first to encounter the British when they first sailed to Australia with the first fleet. And led by the very famous Aboriginal warrior Pemulwuy, the Behaviours people resisted and fought against British colonisation. And there was 12 years of guerrilla warfare against the colonists up until the death of Pemulwuy, I think around 1801. And I think about this a lot, and I try to imagine what this must have been like, particularly as I'm walking through this area and exploring the bush around what we call the Cooks River today. And I really try and imagine the resilience that the Behaviours people had. Pemulwuy was cracked in the skull by a very famous bushranger. He was shot in the head and the body several times, and he still managed to avoid capture for 12 years. And this story just feels particularly resonant and important for me to share today for a lot of reasons, but particularly because we'll be exploring the idea of decolonisation and what that looks like as a lens and a principle for learning partnerships. And I remember reading that upon Pemulwuy's death, the British said of him, they said, he's very brave, he's very independent, but he's a terrible pest to the colony. And so I suppose that one of my hopes is that in our own way and through the work that we're doing, we continue to carry out Pemulwuy's legacy of being brave, but also being a pest to the colony. So on that note, let's start the webinar. My name is Jess. I'm a program manager here at CPI ANZ, and I'll be hosting today. And our webinar today is going to be all about exploring some of the tools and the frameworks and the approaches that we use in our learning partnerships here at CPI. Just a few housekeeping things to mention right up top. Closed captions have been enabled, and you'll be able to turn those on via your Zoom settings if you would like closed captions. We are recording today's webinar, and we will be sharing it out in an email along with the slides that we're sharing. We do have the Q&A function enabled as well, so you should be able to use that to ask questions and upvote on questions that are coming through. We also love to see a lot of activity in the chat as well, so please feel very welcome. I see people sharing the lands that they're coming on. Please feel very welcome to keep dialogue open in the chat as well. We will be moving into breakout groups at the end of the session, so we'll talk a little bit about what those look like when we get there. But essentially, to give you a sense of the plan for this webinar, for about sort of the first hour or 50 minutes, we'll be hearing from each of the panelists speak to a different learning approach that they use. And then we'll have the option to move into breakout groups for those of you who would like to have a bit more of an intimate discussion with the panelists. So speaking of presenters, we're really lucky today to be joined by three very brilliant colleagues from CPI. So now I'd love to invite each of our three presenters to really quickly, in just 30 seconds, introduce yourselves and the tool, and name the tool that you'll be speaking to. So perhaps we can hear from Alli first, and then Naja, and then Saumya.
Thanks, Jess. And hi, everybody. It's always weird to be in a webinar where you can't see or hear everybody else on the call, but lovely to see so many of you out there from around the world. I am Alli Edwards. I'm a senior program manager here at CPI, and I am calling in from unceded Wurundjeri country. Really excited to share some of the tools and approaches that we use today. And I'll pass it forward to Naja.
Hi everyone, my name is Naja Nelson. I am calling in from Washington, D.C. I'm a senior associate on the team, super excited to be here today and learning more about the great work that's happening in this community of practice. And I will be presenting the systems behavior framework, and happy to pass over to Saumya.
Thanks, Naja, and thank you everyone for joining today. My name is Saumya Shruti, and I am a senior associate here at CPA on the Global Development Initiative. Currently, I'm based out of California on land previously stewarded by the Ohlone people of the Bay. And I'm very excited to talk about our decolonization framework, how we use it and how we struggle with it at CPI, and to learn from you all about it today as well. So I will pass it back to Jess.
Thank you. Awesome. And we'll be hearing plenty more from Alli and Naja and Saumya throughout the webinar, and plenty less from me. So don't worry about that. But before we do get into the juicy details of the approaches that we'll be hearing about today, I thought it might be helpful to just provide some upfront context around how we think about and understand learning partnerships here at CPI. So learning partnerships are something that's really core to our practice. And essentially what they involve is walking alongside a team or an organisation for an extended period of time to enable and support them to centre learning and relationships in their work. And so we often act as learning partners to governments, public servants, and any organisations or teams across that really vast network of change makers who are working to be reimagining government. So each learning partnership we run looks different, as they're very much tailored to the current situation or project that we're supporting our partners with. But the type of components that you might expect to see in learning partnerships could include things like listening sessions, collective sense making, supporting with experimentation, coaching and peer coaching, learning circles and workshops to be reflecting together, surfacing learnings, exploring new ideas and learning about new approaches, conducting action research, and doing things like action learning together. So they're really about learning through doing, essentially. And you're going to hear a lot more from our presenters today. They're going to speak in more detail, not only about the approaches that we use, but also some examples of how these methods and approaches have been applied in the learning partnerships as well. So hopefully today you'll walk away with a bit more of a richer picture of what learning partnerships look like and the methods and tools that we use to support them as well. So with that, I am going to hand to Alli now, who's going to start with an activity and speak to evocative images. So over to you, Alli.
Thanks, Jess. So like Jess started to mention, at CPI, we really love learning through doing. And whenever possible, we like to show and not tell. So what we'll do, we thought this would be a fun sort of entry into today's conversation with each other, is before I talk a bit about the tool of evocative images, we're going to have a few minutes to play around with them together. So we are here talking about learning and about tools that we use in learning partnerships. And there's so many different ways to kind of conceptualize learning and think about your own relationship and lived experience with learning. So open invitation, would love to spend just a few minutes and invite you to think, when you look at these images, what is it about them that resonates with how you think about learning? So looking at the different images, what resonates with your idea about learning? And then if we were going to ask you to pick just one image that most resonated, we'd love for you to just share in the chat what image did you pick? And briefly, why did you pick that image? Thanks, Armand. Good to see you. And quick typing there. So which image are you choosing and why are you sharing that image? What resonates with you when you think about learning? Great to see responses coming in. We have weaving, busy bees because learning on the run or on the fly. Trees and growth, the collaboration that we see in the elephant. Growth in interconnected ecosystems, absolutely. So the tree and the lichen and the moss and everything that's supporting that tree, it's gorgeous. Weaving, because learning's about assembling different elements to allow something new to emerge. Yeah, so that collaborative effort and creating something new together. I love that because that gets the kind of like impact orientation of learning, like learning towards what end. Weaving and working together, using hands and in a group. Yes, thanks, Jade. Love that sort of material aspect of learning and doing together. The middle, working together, adding to others' contributions and making something. Yeah, and I love the weaving and the people that are adding that you're kind of making something together. So it's not about taking out or removing or proving that it's wrong, but it's about adding to and seeing how these different ideas look together. Trees, because the nature informs so much about the way that we can be in the world. Absolutely, oh, it's beautiful. Good to see you on that. Tree, because it takes time. And I love it. And we see the guy on the computer, maybe one of the less common ones in this chat, but super valid. And it's great to be able to kind of see this range of perspectives. I'd be curious, what about the guy on the computer is kind of resonating with this idea of learning to you? Love seeing trees and organic growth. We see the rocks. I think this is the first appearance that the rocks have made in our chat, where we're thinking about the foundations and adding information on top of these really strong foundations. That's beautiful, a metaphor there, Monica. The tree growing in branches, learning new and different things. Elephants, because there's a baby that has a lot to learn, but great memories and mentors. I love that. That's beautiful. So like learning is a communal and like looking up to the mentors and the elders. The tree, because growth, it's also part of an ecosystem. Some's visible, some's invisible. The invisible learning is so interesting to think about. What's the sort of hidden curriculum behind some of the things that we can learn, and how are we learning about ourselves and others through different topics? Elephants, about learning from elders and learning through childlike curiosity. That is absolutely a great mindset to go into any learning experience with. So now we have the computer guy, because you have to sit and memorize stuff and commit it to memory, and learning by reading articles and best practices online before you do the hands-on activity. Thank you so much for elaborating upon that. And you can see even in one image, there's multiple ways to interpret it. And I'm sure even though like the rock image and the computer image were a little bit less common, if I asked you to really try, really push yourself and think about how does that computer image relate to your beliefs about learning or resonate in some way with learning experiences, it might not be like a direct thought, but in this kind of oblique way, you can push your thinking to make that new connection. So the way that these evocative images work, there's lots of different sorts of theories around like embodied cognition and the way that we think with more than just our brain. But just thinking about the sort of cognitive way that we process images. You can imagine if you're like an early cave person and you're roaming around in the world, you don't need the language to articulate like, I have a hypothesis that these red berries are going to be juicy and delicious, but those pink ones over there made me sick. You don't need to articulate that reasoning, but you do need a visual cue that says like, that's pink, it could be bad. That's red, that was juicy last time. So that visual processing is really deep and really back in the back part of our brain that evolved first. And it is actually really activated like 60,000 times faster than the prefrontal cortex, which is the part that deals with our reasoning and our articulation. So when we look at an image, you instantly get different associations and ways of thinking that are a lot more ancient and a lot more embodied than when we ask you like, well, can you articulate what you mean by that? Or if I asked each of you to like share, like, what does learning mean to you? I'm sure everyone would have beautiful, rationalized ways of responding. But what these images let us do is kind of enter into a topic through a more oblique way. And it also gives us an opportunity to think not just with each other by hearing from the different perspectives, but also thinking with the images. And we get to have that kind of internal conversation where we're saying, is learning like a rock? Or I don't know why, but I'm just really drawn to the tree. What's happening here? What do I like about it? And so in that kind of internal questioning and reflecting, it provides a more personal and a less direct way into the sorts of topics and questions. And so on the next slide, you will be hearing about a range of tools and approaches, some of them very important and deep and really necessary for the sort of work and impact that we want to be having. But we thought that this would be a more fun, kind of light sort of tool to introduce that you could take away and use in a lot of different contexts. So we use evocative images at CPI often as a warm-up, sometimes in learning materials that are being given to groups to use without us facilitating, because as you've just seen, it's fairly easy to have a conversation around what image is resonating when you think about this topic. We've used it with learning partnerships when we're just kind of arriving together to say, hey, how are you arriving? How are you feeling about this project coming up? Which of these images speak to you? And so it just provides a kind of different way to think and reflect. So as we've just experienced together, we can use it to warm up to a topic. And it's not just an icebreaker. The way that we like to use these, it actually connects us into the topic. So now having heard from each other and these different understandings and conceptualizations about learning, we're thinking about the topic of learning in different ways. And we're also starting to warm up to each other. So we're kind of seeing how there's different experiences, and somebody that sees learning as really relational and passed on through generations, or as part of an ecosystem and supported by the other elements in the ecosystem, it has just as much truth and validity as somebody that's saying that learning comes from a computer screen and requires a lot of memorization and putting in the time and the effort and learning about best practices. There's elements of truth in all the different responses that can kind of help us inform how we're thinking about the topic from lots of different perspectives. It can also be a fun chance to get to know people better. So doing this in a team and surfacing different beliefs and starting to kind of examine why and unpack and say, oh, that's interesting. Like, what do you mean by that? Like, why is it like that and not this? And starting to see differences. Like maybe nobody chose the rocks. And so like, what does that say about our beliefs about like foundational knowledge and wisdom, or about longer time that it takes to kind of form different ideas? And so like what isn't selected can be as interesting as how people talk about the really common ones as well. It's also a good way to warm up to words. There are so many different ways to think and process, and having that opportunity to kind of go through a bunch of different ideas by yourself with an image and think in those different ways before you have to kind of start talking about the topic can be an interesting way to kind of start processing and to think through different metaphors. So we love evocative images. You're welcome to use them in warm-ups and discussions in any way you want. And in our breakout room, we'll talk a little bit more about intentional warm-ups as opposed to icebreakers, and also the use of kind of evocative, visual, creative methods for starting conversations. I think we should have a few minutes for questions. Is that right, Jess?
Yes, absolutely. I'd love to invite questions from the panelists if they have any they'd like to ask you, Alli.
Yeah, Alli, thank you so much for walking us through that really fun activity and just like getting us in the mindset for some of these conversations that we're about to have. But I'm really curious to hear a little bit more about how, if you have a story or some example where you've seen evocative images deepen understanding and transformation in practice.
Ooh, so there's a couple parts to that. So I think there's like the deepening understanding. And I think even before you get to the deepening, you need to get to the kind of like surfacing that there's different ways to understand and a plurality of perspectives there. And then the second part of your question was around the transformation. So like I could be wrong, and I'd be keen to discuss if there's anybody else's experience where this does transformational work. I would argue, I think, that the transformation in learning happens when you kind of integrate new information and then actually apply it and do something differently. I think for this tool specifically, it's more about that kind of surfacing and then deepening and becoming more curious about different ways of understanding or entering into a topic. I guess to prove myself wrong, perhaps, one story is a team that was using these asynchronously, and we provided a bunch of different sets of these for different topics throughout our learning partnership. And then in our 6-month evaluation on the kind of ongoing impact, they shared that actually as a team, they kept doing this in their weekly check-in, and they would put together different images because they wanted to hear how people are arriving. And so it wasn't just discussing what needs to happen, but taking time to kind of check in with people and do that kind of learning more about each other conversation. So I would argue that's a little bit of a transformation, but still that this is more about the kind of surfacing and becoming curious. Thanks for the question. That was a good one. I think there's also a question I can see in the chat. Amanda getting right to the hard-hitting questions. So there's different, so like photo elicitation is a qualitative research method. And so participants would be kind of like photographing things throughout their day relating to the question by the researcher. And then as you kind of review the photos together, the sort of meaning and research like data would come up. Evocative images is like same but different. You can have participants select an image depending on the kind of space that you're working in and their technical proficiency. And it's excellent when you say like, find an image that resonates with you and put it in the chat or in the Miro board. So that's a good way to kind of give the power back to the participants. It's also a bit technologically tricky for some groups. To actually answer your question, when we're collating the images, it depends on the topic. So if there's like an accepted kind of framework, especially one that you'll be speaking to, we love to find images that kind of directly correspond to the framework so that you're making sure that there's a wide variety of things that are captured and that it kind of relates to the content. Having done that several times as well, people will always interpret it differently than what you think because it's so subjective, and that's the beauty in this exercise. So as an entry into this, I would say have between like 6 and 12 images, have a variety that include people, non-humans, different body parts, different configurations of multiple people and individuals and no people. And it's great if there's different, how do I describe this? If there's like different elements to the photo, so it's not just about the compost, it's also about the shovel and what's in the compost, or it's not just about a tree, it's about the other branches and how it's rhizomatic and the shape that it makes, if that makes sense. We've tried working with AI to create images, and they're just not as evocative because they're really good at like, here's a subject and it's doing the prompt that you said. But it misses the richness and that kind of what people bring to an image where you're like, oh, and I know how that feels because I've done that. Or I know how the wooden block feels, and it's that physical relating to the photo. So as of now, we tend to use photos. You can do it with artwork and make it more abstract. Yeah, I think it's a bit of trial and error and seeing what works for you. It's an excellent question. And I think there is no like best practice. Asita and I have talked this a little bit about like, well, how do you even pick the right images? And even if you pick an image that nobody picks, then that's still information and it's still an interesting discussion.
Thank you,
Thanks for the
Alli.
question.
Thank you, Alli. Yeah, great question, Amanda. Thank you. I'm wondering if I could ask a follow-up question of you as well, Alli. I know you and I know how passionate you are about this work that you do. And I'm wondering what led you to this place of passion, particularly when thinking about this methodology and using evocative images?
That's a good question. I think it's tricky because my background is in visual communications and in design. And like the reason I'm here at CPI is because I've always been so interested in how people learn in ways that aren't just reading an article or just being told how to do something and going and doing it or seeing how someone else does it, but a bit more creative and generative. I think just acknowledging that different people process information differently, that there's different ways to think, and there's ways to get curious about each other is what really makes this an exciting sort of warm-up and tool for me to use. Good question, Jess.
That's beautiful. Oh, we've got one more from Monica that's come through. What was the question that you, Ali, asked today to get us thinking about the images? Yeah, great question.
Great question. Typically, and you could go back to the slide so I can make sure that this is accurate. Typically, the way I like to enter into it is asking what about the image resonates. A good kind of like first step can also be the invitation to look at the images, think about learning, and think how each image could kind of speak to learning in some way, and then asking people to pick one image. And I think the reason, like, what resonates with you is kind of the key part of any question for me, because it's like these don't literally translate to learning. It's not like a graduation hat or a textbook. So I think just thinking about the different resonances and acknowledging that there's many of them, and then asking people to kind of share like why they chose that image. And it could be as simple as like pick an image that represents learning to you. I like resonance because I feel like it's just more a little bit collaborative between you and the image.
Thanks, Ali.
Yeah. So what about the image resonates? Great.
That's beautiful.
Thanks.
I love hearing you talk about this. Fantastic. So we will have a bit of an opportunity if you'd like to get more into the nitty-gritty with Ali on evocative images when we move to breakouts towards the end of the session. But I'd love to hear now from Naja talking about the system behavior framework and reflecting on the health of a system. So over to you, Naja.
Thank you. Super excited to be delving in and talking about this topic. Before I delve into just immediately talking about the framework itself, I think it's worth to just like contextualize this to talk about maybe how like CPI came into relation with this framework and why we think it's really beneficial for people in a variety of different contexts. So for reference, I mentioned at the top, I'm supporting our Global Development Initiative alongside Saumya. And for us as a initiative, the thing that's really keeping us all moving and what we're working toward is really wanting to decolonize the global development sector, which as this goal, it can feel really nebulous and really big and complex. However, we're really thinking about this in like a couple of buckets and the ways in which, you know, maybe there's parts of how the global development sector functions that if we can really get in there and like ensure it's a place where there's deep collaboration happening, where there's power sharing happening, we can support those goals of decolonization. And one of those areas that are a core part of the global development sector is monitoring and evaluation. Just because we know how much it influences how projects operate and how projects are funded, it's just a really core part of what keeps the machine and the engine running within the sector. And so most recently, over the last year, we've been partnering with UNDP's Systems Monitoring, Learning, and Evaluation Initiative, really focused on how do we create resources and things that people can use really tangibly so that they can measure systems change, right? Because a lot of us doing work, we want to feel like the work we're doing matters and is contributing to a lot of things that that ultimately create better outcomes for communities. And so that's kind of how we arrived at the systems behavior framework. So for us, it was about looking for organizations that were doing really meaningful and out of the box ways to look for ways to measure systems change, but also, you know, in our goals of really wanting to focus on decolonization, looking for ways where maybe the ways in which they arrived at these frameworks really centered co-design, power sharing, and that's how we arrived. So now zooming out now that I've talked about how we came to this framework, a little bit about the framework. Framework was created in 2018 by the Lankelly Chase Foundation, which is based in the UK. They're an organization that really focuses on trying to address root causes of supporting people with severe and multiple disadvantages in society. They've primarily focused a lot of this work on folks within like the mental health sector, addiction, and domestic violence. So back in 2018, as an internal organization, they were really trying to figure out, like, since they were funding a lot of great work, they were like, how do I know that this is really making a difference? How do I really know that what we're doing, like if we close today, that there's that there is change happening. So that's really a lot of the questions that were coming up for them. And so for them, they felt like when they were looking around, there weren't a lot of tools and frameworks to help them answer this question. So they were like, maybe we have to really get serious about like creating those tools that other people can use. And so through a process of co-design with 200 individuals, they had about 7 to 8 workshops, partnering with folks that they were funding, like local organizations, to really ask them like what works in relationships, right? Like how do we understand like whether or not there's a good relationship that's happening within complex systems. And for them, they were really trying to figure out the relationships aspects because, as I said, like systems, if you think about them in this really nebulous, really grand and complex thing, you can feel really detached for them, even though we're all like playing in them, shaping them, influencing them. So they really wanted to focus on that relational aspect of how do people feel in these dynamics. And so as a result of those mini workshops and getting to work with and hear from a lot of people, they came up with this framework organized by these 3 Ps: power, perspective, and participation. And that within each of these larger pillars, people can rate each of these individual factors. So when we're thinking about power, they're thinking about the power dynamics that happen within a system, right? So ideally, if there's healthy power dynamics, power is typically shared and there's like equality of voices, and that decision making isn't necessarily coming top down, but it's a lot more devolved, a lot more collaborative. And also accountability tends to happen in more of a mutual way. So like in a lot of traditional standpoints with like funders and grantees, we might think about accountability as this thing that grantees need to demonstrate to funders to guarantee to like make the case for why they get money, when in reality, if they're in a relationship with one another, that accountability should be mutual. So similarly, when we look at perspectives, some examples of things that they were hearing recurring was that if you're in a healthy relationship dynamic, people will feel like they share a vision, they feel connected to the work, that people feel well resourced, people feel like they're a part of something really big, right? They don't feel like they're operating in silos, but it feels really interconnected. And then lastly, when we reflect on like just participation dynamics, typically if something is healthy, they have found that it's typically the language that people may use is that it's open, it's trusting. And that once again, when we think about leadership, it might not fall into like the traditional way where it's like the person at the top and then there's the person at the bottom. It's typically a little bit more flattened where it's collaborative, and at each and every level, there's collaboration happening. So that's a little bit about the systems behavior framework and how it came to be, and why we're really excited about it as CPI. And I can share in the chat later as well the blog that we wrote in partnership with UNDP that walks through just a little bit more detail of how it came to be and how you might apply it if other folks are really interested in using it.
Thank you, Naja. I'd love to hear if we have any questions from panelists or in the chat as well. Saumya, I think you had a question.
Great. I can ask, but I also wanted to see if Alli had any questions since I asked the question last.
You go ahead with yours first. And I
Okay,
see
great.
that as well.
Okay. Naja, thank you so much for sharing. And this work is really tied to the core of what we do at GDI in terms of decolonization and from the power perspective, especially. And I'm curious, right now you were talking about how this was applied to very specific systems contexts with the work that Lankelly Chase did. But how do you see this being applied in different systems contexts and with different partners doing this work? How do you get people to think this way about accountability, to reimagine what measurement, evaluation, and learning looks like?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think it's actually funny because when we were like in the process of creating this case study, we did a couple of interviews with the people who like supported it, and like one person talked about how they use it not for work purposes, like they use it for like their romantic relationship to be like, is there mutual accountability? Is there openness? Is the power being shared? So I definitely think that someone could make the case that it could be used outside of just the health system. um, I think that at the core of it, like a lot of the language that's used is not necessarily health specific. I would still also push that, like, if someone wanted to replicate a framework, I think you should feel empowered to maybe like adapt and approach it in a co-design approach similarly to how they did, right? Like this came as a result of them doing some co-design sessions and asking people how would it feel for this dynamic that we have to be healthy. um, but I do think it could be potentially used in other places, like an example. I think particularly when thinking about like funder and grantee relationships, right? I think it could be interesting to explore that just more broadly, because I think that that relationship can impact how work happens at the local level. So zooming outside of health systems, just like it could be potentially used.
Thank you. And I'm also seeing we've got a question in the chat from Emma as well. Have you seen this work beyond an organisation or team? Oh, a couple more. And has it been applied perhaps to an industry?
So maybe not, I guess the answer to that would be not yet, right? Like I think Lankelly Chase used this back in 2018 when they like created it. And I think that they would ideally, they haven't necessarily been able to like continue to use it beyond some of their internal work. Um, I think it has the potential to be used and with other organizations, but the answer to that would be like, no, it hasn't been used beyond this organization or applied to a specific industry. But I think it's worth exploring someplace else.
Thanks, Naja. We've got lots of questions coming through. I don't know if we'll have time for all of them, but I see this one from Stuart. What does use of this look like in practice? How do people engage with the concept?
So when we talked to Lankelly Chase, they use it a lot, like internally and like internal staff meetings. It's kind of like a check-in after they gathered this information to like be like, hey, like based on the information of maybe how we scored, right? Like let's say that we found that we were falling low on mutual accountability. They can then use that as a place to like create different interventions internally, right? They kind of use it as um, an internal checker to just see what's working well, what's not working well, and then it can open up for just like larger discussions about uh, how they might approach it differently. I think the caveat to this is that it might not be like a traditional like framework where it's like, hey, like if you get this outcome, if you get this score, you do this. As much as this is just a reflection tool for people to just like examine and assess their relationships.
Thanks, Naja. We've got lots of questions coming through, and as I said, we will be moving into breakouts, which will be an opportunity to dig a little bit deeper on these concepts. So maybe Megan and Cassie, you can hold your questions potentially for the breakout with Naja. And on that note, time is flying, my goodness. I'm really keen now to hear from Saumya, who will be speaking to decolonisation as a lens and principle for learning partnerships. So over to you, Saumya.
Great. Thank you so much, Jess. And thank you, Naja and Alli, for sharing some of the tools that I think are really pushing forward a different way of working, whether that's in the development sector or more broadly in the place in your workplace, however that may look. At the Global Development Initiative team at CPI, our North Star is decolonization. And Naja really touched on that in a very practical space that we've been exploring that. But if we take a step back, decolonization is so much. It is a big term. And I'd love to hear from you all that have been able to join here. Just in the chat, if you're able to share, what does decolonization actually mean to you? what you see here is reflections from an activity where we invited some practitioners just a few weeks ago to talk about what decolonization means to us and the act of decolonizing in workspaces. There's a lot of language here around acknowledging histories of thinking about liberation and justice, about sharing power, about the world being complex and leaning into that complexity. But I want to hear from you all what this means to you. So I'll give folks just a few minutes here. Thank you, Megan. Sharing power, absolutely. And Emma, giving land back, unlearning problematic modern colonial habits, absolutely. And it's also totally okay to not have an answer here, but if folks have a few more thoughts, I'd love to hear. Yes, reparations to Black and Brown people, justice. So as you can see here clearly, oh, there's a few more. Sorry, I'm going to read those out as well. Challenging norms that perpetuate imbalances in power and privileges. Yes. Understanding how the past has affected the present and choosing a different way forward. Spaciously holding and exploring thoughts, behaviors, stories, histories, and actions. Such beautiful words in the chat. And what a great way to almost end. Smash the white supremacy. Appreciating both how much I benefit from and am blind to how this benefit comes from others being disenfranchised. Truth telling. Ah, yes, so much good perspective here to harvest in on. And I really want to lean into this, the idea of like seeing and not seeing, what is visible and not visible, being blind to something and having the ability to view. And so, Jess, if you can go to the next slide, I kind of want to talk about how we think about this at CPI itself, knowing that one, we are no expert in this space. I think when the GDI was formed, the Global Development Initiative was formed 2 years ago, the people that came into this space just had this deep conviction of we want to make decolonization our North Star, knowing that the development sector is an arm of colonization or a product of colonization. We live in a post-colonial world. So we want to undo the harm or work towards undoing the harms that have been perpetuated by the way the system is currently set up. But that means that there's this huge umbrella under which we are operating of what decolonization is, and that goes from the very internal shifting of mindsets, shifting of the way we see the world, unlearning, relearning, to being very bold in our actions, from reparations to speaking to the truths, to acknowledging histories. We've come to this idea that decolonization is a verb, decolonizing is a verb, and that shows up in 3 ways in our team, or we try to think about it in 3 ways. One, the redistributing of power and resources, the reclaiming of narratives, ownership, and expertise, and then the reorienting of the vision, values, and purpose of global development, which comes to this pyramid that you see on the left here of seeing decolonization at different spheres of influence in individual, organizational, and systemic system or systemic places, I guess. And at each bubble, at each level, there's different levels of power that you have to actually influence how you are doing the action of decolonizing, from the very basic, the most internal, and the most fundamental in our belief of mindsets and ways of being, to the cultures at your organization or the culture within which you are operating in your organization, in your region, in your community, and then more practically to the actual practices that are happening here in all of those spaces that I just mentioned above. And all of this to say is that we, like I said, we aren't experts. We don't know how what the perfect way of doing decolonization is. And I think that's part of the point, that there is no one way to approach it, but we're always asking ourselves questions of where do we have the power to practice it? Decolonization is acknowledging histories and the current moment, and how are we able to use the power that we have in our spaces to call out where colonization is still happening, and where the effects of colonization continue to happen as well. How do we engage with complexities when values are clashing? When we're pushing against the ideas of white supremacy or the black and white thinking that has really shaped the way that those in power, those in colonial power, have really influenced our mindsets and our paradigms about what is good and what is bad. Taking a step back and realizing that living in this world and living in complexity means that there is no one right or wrong way, but rather evaluating the values that we hold deep, and in every context that we step into, which value is going to create the least harm and empower the most people. Creating spaces for learning and practicing accountability for harm that will be created is also part of decolonizing, of understanding that we are humans, and at the core of ourselves, we are going to create harm to some level. But when we lean into our humanity, we give ourselves grace to be able to show up for people when they are harming, and when we are harming. And so decolonization is a vulnerability and being able to be held accountable. And then finally, really thinking about who we're centering in our work. And the pretty straightforward question, but who is at the margins, who remains at the margins, whose voice are we listening to, and who are we thinking about elevating? These are questions that we have that we answer in very different ways in different projects. For instance, one of the projects that we did with these students from Harvard who were doing a policy analysis exercise explored what decolonization in action looks like, but in relation to energy systems in South Asia. And that was quite a specific research project, but the questions that they asked showed levels of empowerment for communities rural communities who gained access to clean power and were now able to be more self-sufficient. But at the same time, understanding that those people still lived on land that they did not own, that they were still being subjugated by different power structures in their own cultures. So what we came to understand through that research was that when there's progress in one way, there's always other lenses to keep in mind, to think about when talking about decolonization. And the last thing that I just want to end with on the idea of decolonization as well, for me, is that it has been such a personal process at CPI. I've had the opportunity to move across the world, move to India, my homeland, in the past 7 months, and really explore what it means to be Indian American, what it means to have these roots. And to me, that's been realizing and relearning what the caste system is and how that exists very clearly, even though it is illegal in the country, and how that there's this invisible hierarchy that I never had, that I never understood, that still exists in America when I come back here. And so when I put this decolonization lens on, whether it's in our work or in my personal life, I feel like I'm taking off the lenses, the glasses that were given to me, that were forced upon me through my education system and the cultures that I grew up in, and putting on ones that I want to wear through the way that I want to see the world, that gives myself and the people that have been harmed through colonization more agency. There are not a lot of answers here of how we do this, but these are just our explorations, our musings, and I'm happy to answer more questions. But in our breakout room, I want to ask everyone to engage with me of what decolonizing looks like at these 3 layers of the pyramid that we have here. So if you're interested in doing that, would love to have you here or there.
Thanks, Saumya. I might start with a variation of a question that I was going to ask before. And I think you've started to do this by describing your own experience in it, but I'm curious if you could speak more to how you invite others into these kind of conversations and topics and practices, and maybe the both invitation and the kind of relational, how do you do this with people side of that thing?
Yes, I'm so sorry to interrupt there, but Absolutely. I think when we see decolonization as this broader umbrella under which there are so many different ways to practice and show up, I think the way that I think about bringing people in on this journey is using the language that resonates most in the context. Because at the end of the day, using the language of decolonization can be really powerful, but it is just a word. And there are different ways to communicate how people who want to do some of the things underneath this bubble of decolonization or umbrella of decolonization, shifting power, shifting paradigms, bringing community in, being much more co-creative, leaning into complexity thinking, being emergent in their practice, is all forms of decolonization. And I can put that narrative spin on that if I want to. But for people, if ultimately if we're able to meet our partners where they're at using other language that we use at CPI that does stem from the world of decolonization, I think that's how we're able to push forward our agenda in the work that we do. But really, like, ask people to think a little more critically about that. Not to co-opt the language at all, because that's not what we're doing. That's not what we're trying to do in the work of watering down decolonization, but also just understanding that the journey is complex and different for everyone, and we are not perfect. And so therefore we want to be just partners in accompanying folks in whatever way they feel comfortable to be challenged.
Thanks, Saumya. And I think we have time. There's a really good question from Emma in the chat around how you cope with the tensions and contradictions between colonization as a verb and working in a capitalist system in a colonized country. If you wanted to answer that one quickly. It's a big question, I know.
One word answer or one sentence answer. That's such a tough question, Emma. And we operate in a system where we're also an arm of the Boston Consulting Group to whatever extent we feel comfortable, or the different regions feel comfortable. But our team has its inception came from direct support from the Boston Consulting Group, who from our board wanted to see how we can step into a space of understanding the development system further. And so in that, there were a lot of assumptions in the way the team has been set up. And there are just a lot of like partners that we have been introduced to or we have been working with that are very much part of the colonist system, in all honesty. And it is really hard. I think we lean back into the idea that decolonization is so many things and can show up in different ways. And the way, I guess, like, cope is the right word here. The way we cope with those tensions is we can introduce these concepts or subtly, as I've heard someone use in the past, hack the system by using different language, by doing different things that asks people to come to this self-reflection place where they're able to explore where the paradigms that they hold for themselves, where they come from. So if you look at this pyramid, that bottom layer, that is the biggest, if we're able to have people start to question that, then that has like catalyzing downstream impact on how they start to question the culture that they're operating in and the practices that they're doing. And that doesn't always mean that, like, and then we're going to smash the white supremacist patriarchal system that we operate in, as someone put in the chat. But I think if we're able to start shifting the stories of people internally, whether they are consultants, whether they are working in the development sector, whether they are communities, or whether they are people the very centralized power, if we're able to do some work that helps them rewrite their narratives or reclaim narratives, then I think that in and of itself is the push that we know that we can do in our systemic space.
Thank you, Saumya. And I'm seeing more questions coming up in the chat, but I am keen to keep us to time. And we will be opening up breakout groups, as I said, and the whole purpose of those will be to have much more of a discursive conversation. So for those of you holding questions, there will be a place for you to direct them towards in just a moment. So what we're going to do now is in just a moment, we're actually going to close off the main webinar and open up 3 new Zoom rooms, one with each presenter. So there'll be a Zoom room with Alli speaking to evocative images, a Zoom room with Naja on reflecting of the health of the system, and a Zoom room with Saumya talking about decolonisation. So to join each of those rooms in just a moment, you will need to click on a separate Zoom link that Asitha will be popping in the chat in just a moment. I must apologise, we were hoping to do very seamless Zoom breakout rooms, and unfortunately some technical issue has happened and I haven't clicked a setting that I needed to click. And so we're blocked from actually using Zoom breakout rooms, which is why we're doing the links. So I apologise, it's a little bit clunky, but we will get you to your breakout should you so choose. For those of you who need to leave on the hour, that's absolutely fine. The breakouts are optional. As I said, it's a chance for you to have a bit more of a conversation with the presenter about the tool that they presented. But what that does mean is that in just a couple of minutes, I'll be leaving you in the hands of the panelists. And we'll be closing off this Zoom room. So I would just like to take a moment to thank everyone while we're all here for joining us today, and to extend a huge thank you to our panelists for speaking to these tools and frameworks. I found it a really wonderful hour. For those of you who haven't already joined the community of practice on Slack, I would encourage you to do that. I'll pop a link in the chat as well, so that's there for you to click through. We host events like this across the year. We will be announcing our next event that will be coming up really soon. That will be looking at futures and foresights methodologies, so be sure to join the Slack to keep up to date with everything that's happening. And as I said, we'll be emailing out the recording of the webinar, as well as the various links and things that we've been speaking about and the slides today. But yeah, as I said, I'd love for those of you who are keen to continue the conversations with the panelists, I'd love for us to start moving into those new Zoom breakout rooms. Asitha has just popped those 3 links in the chat now. So now will be the time that I say goodbye to our panelists, and they're going to go off and open up those new Zoom links now. And for those of you who'd like to continue the conversation, click through to the link for Alli if you'd like to continue chatting with her about evocative images, the link for Naja in the chat to talk about reflecting on the health of the system, and the link to continue the conversation with Saumya on decolonisation. So I'll let you all click through and join those. And again, thank you all so much for joining us today. And sorry for those of you if you're hearing noises around me. There's a dog who's crying and running around me and knocking things over. So gotta love it. Gotta love it. That's life, isn't it? Yeah, poor pup indeed. Excellent. So I can see people are slowly trickling out and joining the breakouts. So again, thank you all so much for joining us today.